Hello, welcome to Seaside Quilting Tutorials. My name is Terry. Today we're going to be making a laptop or tablet sleeve, just something that you can slide onto it so that you can travel your tablet around with you and keep it, safe so you don't scratch up your surface. This is a pretty beginner project, so I feel pretty confident that pretty much anyone that's new to sewing can definitely do this. So let's go ahead and get started. So I just want to mention that this project will require you to make a bias binding for the project, and I've done a separate tutorial for the bias binding so that any time that a project is going to need binding on the bias, which is just bias that is cut. Usually we use about a half a yard of fabric, and it's cut at a 45-degree angle instead of width of fabric. It leaves it so that it has a little more stretch to it. So if you're going to be making this project, go ahead and watch this tutorial to see what you need to do, and then go back to Seaside Quilting Supplies and check out the bias binding making tutorial. I did it separately on purpose for that reason, because there will be several times that it will come up that we're going to need to do binding. And this is one of the types of binding, and I'm going to be making other tutorials for the other types of binding as well, to be able to do the same thing. And it just makes it a little quicker for you so that you can watch the quick tutorial and then go ahead and refer back to the others. Some people know how to make bias binding, some don't. So anyways, that's one thing that you'll want to remember to do when we come to that point. So our first step that we needed to do, and I'm using my surface. I don't have a tablet per se, but this can become a tablet. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to measure the width of your tablet or your laptop. And then you'll want to measure the height of it. So once you have your measurements down, basically you want to, and I measured and I decided that I wanted it about 3 inches. Well, actually I went 3.5 inches wider, because I know I'm going to lose a half an inch with putting my binding on. And then I tripled my height. So if your height is, say, 11 inches, you're going to triple that and you're going to cut it out 33 inches. If your height is 10 inches, then 30 inches, and so forth. So whatever your height is, just triple that. And just to double check, what I did was, before I even cut my fabric completely, I first checked and made sure that my length was going to be enough going across, and I feel comfortable that when I'm sliding this in and out, that it's going to be tight around it, but not so tight that I'm trying to wiggle it in there and distort the fabric just trying to insert it. And then the other thing that I did was I laid, once I cut how wide I was going to need my fabric, before I cut my length, I went and I put my tablet on it, or my surface rather, on it, and then I folded it to make sure that when it folds, I'm going to have just a little bit of a lip up here for coverage, and that when I fold it over, that it's going to come down to a reasonable point for me, so that it's going to be completely wrapped around and covered. And then, I did my measurement, and basically what I did was I folded over where I thought I was going to cut it and checked it. And when I felt comfortable that that was going to be enough, then I went ahead and cut the length of my fabric. So you're going to want a top fabric. You're going to want an inside fabric, which will be your lining. And you're going to want to cut your batting the same size. And then you're just going to take those 3 pieces and you're going to sandwich them together, which just basically means that you're going to take your top fabric and lay it on top of your batting, and then lay your backing on top of that. Once you have those 3 pieces together, decide how you want to quilt them. If you're new to quilting, all I did was I just drew some lines with a ruler across my fabric, and I just did some diagonal lines. If you would like it to look more like you have boxes on there, you could go in one direction with your lines, and then you can turn it and go in the other direction with your lines. For today, I just did diagonal lines. It's going to keep it quilted enough. The fabric's not going to shift. The batting's not going to shift inside of it, and I'm pretty happy with it. Sometimes I like to have, you know, the more basket look to it, the more quilted look to it. Other times I quilt on my long arm on them, but for today, I just felt like let's do something different, so that's what I did. So now, once you have that all done, we're going to go ahead, whoops, I'm dropping stuff all over the place behind me. So once you do that, let me see, I was trying to find a ruler here so that we can do some measuring. So you're going to find the top. Now if you're using a directional fabric, make sure whichever side that you're using directional fabric on, that you have, if you have directional on both sides, make sure that you have your top set to your top and on both sides. I don't have a directional fabric, I just have all over fabric, so it's not going to matter which end I pick to be my top. So then we just want to find the middle of our fabric. So I'm just going to fold this in half. Actually, I'll fold it in half the other way so I can make my mark on the back side. Not that it's going to matter, because you can, you know, you can either use chalk, or I'm using a Frixion pen. I'm just going to make a quick mark for my center. So I folded it in half, and I'm just going to make a mark there as a guide so that I know where my center is. And then I'm going to grab my ruler. And so I'm just going to double check with my ruler to make sure that I was accurate with my center. Yep, that should do it. And so from there, we're going to measure let me see, I'm going to measure 3.5 inches down on the side. And I'm going to make a mark. So I just measured 3.5 from the top down and made a mark. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. And it doesn't matter what ruler you use, just as long as you're able to measure down and keep it straight and make your mark. So I've got 3.5 inches from the top down on this side and on the other side all marked out. And then you're going to line your ruler up so that you're over the end of your ruler is over here where your center mark is, and line it up with your mark over here for your 3.5 inches. And we're going to cut that because we're going to make kind of like an envelope. So we just cut that right off. So you see we've got that slant there, which is going to create our envelope top. Let me find my mark on the other side, and I'm just going to double check to make sure that I did do my 3.5. I did. I like to double check before I cut, because you can't fix it if it's too short afterward. It'll be too late. Okay, so once we have that so that we're at our mark at the center and we're at our mark on the side, and it's a good thing I double checked again just because I was a little bit off, and I'll cut that piece off. So once you have those two cuts made, then you have your envelope top. Now the other thing that I'm going to do before I forget to do it while I'm at this point is I'm going to lay my surface on here where I would want it to be if this was all made, and I'm going to fold it up. And I'm going to leave probably about a 1/2 inch at the top. That will be kind of my lip. At the top, and then I'm going to fold it up, and I'm going to fold my top down, and I'm just going to lay something on there temporarily. And I've just got some elastic. It's just, I think it's like 1/8 of an inch wide elastic, kind of like what we were using when we were making masks. Nothing spectacular, just regular old elastic. You can get it, I think, in white and black. There's also other elastic that you can get in different colors that's more round. You could use that as well. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to hold our elastic in that center, and we're going to wrap it around so that it comes back up around the other side. And you want just a little bit of stretch when you're bringing it up around. Not a lot of stretch. You don't want it overstretched. Let me get this underneath here. So I want to hold it right there in the center. I want it to be tight. So I kind of have to lift this up a little bit to make sure that I've got my elastic under there. And I'm going to bring it up around, and like I said, I want just a little bit of stretch, but not a lot of stretch. And so when I bring those two pieces together, after I've wrapped it around, I'm just going to hold my finger, or you could make a little mark there with your pen. I'll hold those so they don't snap away from me. And you can make a little mark on your elastic. because we don't want to cut it yet. All right, so now I can let go of that elastic. I'm going to look for my mark, and that's what's going to be my center, so to speak. And then I'm going to double it. So it's all one piece, but doubled. And now I'll cut it there. And that's all that we're going to need for an elastic, not a lot. So basically what I'm going to be doing with this is when I put my binding on, I'm going to have this in the center, and I'm going to sew it down with my binding. And when I'm all done making my sleeve, I'm going to sew a button here so that when I bring it all the way around and back up, I've got that little bit of stretch, and I'll be able to put it over my button, and my button will hold that in place. And that will just keep your cover down. Now, there is an option if you don't want to do it this way. I kind of like this way. It makes me feel like one of those like journals that you wrap your elastic around or your cord around and use it for holding your journal together. I just kind of like that idea. But if you don't want to do it that way, you don't have to use the elastic or the button. You could, after we're all done, you could take one of those loop and hook pieces of Velcro, and you could attach a piece here and measure where it's going to be down here and put your next piece there, and you could use Velcro to keep it together. I just like the idea of the elastic and the button. I thought it would make it real cute, so that's what I'm going to be doing with mine. Okay. So I'm going to set this over here at my machine so I don't forget that I'm going to be attaching that when I get to that point. So now what we're going to do is we're going to attach our bias binding. So if you haven't made your bias binding, you'll want to go ahead and make that. And at the end of my bias binding, I've got this point sticking out. I'm not going to need that, so I'm just going to fold it over. And I'm going to trim that so that I get rid of that. So I'll just have a flat edge like that. And we're going to be attaching our bias binding 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and I just rolled mine up. Just makes it easier because this, I think from a 1/2 yard, I think you get around 160, 170 inches, maybe even 180. I can't remember now. I didn't measure. I just do a 1/2 yard at a time, and if I have extra left over, then I leave it in a box. I have a box of different colors that I've made up. Some is left over, some like black I use quite often, white I use quite often, so often I'll just make it ahead of time and just keep it in one of those plastic shoe boxes, and when I need it, I have it. So we're going to be attaching our binding on the front side first. And the reason why I'm doing it on the front side first, I know if you've done other binding on other projects, such as quilts and whatnot, if you were doing it on your machine, you probably attached it from the back first and then flip it over to the front. But I don't want this edge to be on my front. I'm going to want it folded over from my front. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to attach this to my front. The other thing that we're going to be doing different is we're not going to connect our ends the same exact way that you would with your binding for a quilt. We're going to do it a little bit different today. But mostly it'll be the same as putting any other binding on for the most part. So I am going to leave just a little bit extra on the end. And I'm going to start right about, not quite where they're going to join together, but almost, you know, when I fold it. And it doesn't, you could start from the bottom even, it would be fine. Actually, the bottom might be kind of nice. Well, because that's going to fold up. Yeah, because that's what I had thought of. When I get done putting my binding on, I'm going to fold this up. And I don't want my joining point to be in the center. So I decided to start on the side. Not that it would matter because you're going to have your envelope coming over. So if you wanted to, you can start on the bottom. You can start on the side. Actually, you know, we will start on the bottom because then it won't show on the side. How's that? Yeah, we'll do that. You just don't want to start super close to your corner on the bottom. It will just make it easier if you start a little ways away from it. So start about center on the bottom. Leave yourself, about 5 inches extra. Not that we're going to need that much extra, but I'm just going to leave that much extra there. And I'm going to bring you a little closer to the machine so that I can show you how to bind this. Now, this is always the trickiest part when we're filming something for a tutorial. Is making sure that we get everything so that it's in the camera. Now, one thing I want to point out is in the beginning, I don't want to land so that where I've joined my bias binding together, I don't want that to be on my corner. It just makes it awkward. It's not that you can't achieve a nice corner with it being there. It just makes it sort of awkward. So I'm going to pull this forward a little bit more than the extra I was going to leave at the beginning, so that when I get to my corner, I won't have that there. Now, as you get going around, that could happen again where a joint ends up on a corner, and then we just deal with it if it does. But in the beginning, starting out, since we know that that would land right on that corner, that would just not be what we would want. So I'm just going to move it over so that it's away from the corner. And if you wanted, you can even, you know, fold your binding. You could put a pin there, and you could run your bias binding all the way around and pin it and clip it as you go, just to see if your joins are going to land on anywhere that's going to be a corner. I've done that on quilts that I wanted to make sure that they came out, that the binding came out looking really smooth and nice. I'm not going to do that today. But if you're feeling concerned about that, go right ahead and do that. So I'm using a 1/4 inch guide foot. If you don't have one, I really recommend to get one. Otherwise, you'll just use your straight regular foot, and you'll just concentrate that you're keeping it on the 1/4 inch on your plate. You can put a piece of tape here, like painter's tape or something like that, to give you a visual guide, and that can be helpful. Some people have the magnets that they can clip onto their plate so that they can line it up. The only problem with mine is that it has a curve of metal over here that would end up hitting on my foot when it's at 1/4 of an inch. It works, and I can kind of get it over here to the side as long as it's not hitting your foot, as long as your foot's not going to come down onto it. You could use one of these as a guide as well. I do have some of the magnetic metal pieces that go on the plate that are just straight and don't have these pieces coming out. But I like my guide foot, so that's what I use whenever I'm doing my 1/4 of an inch. Just makes it easier for me and quicker. Okay, so you're going to want to have your needle down in needle down position the whole time. That way when we get to a corner and we need to pivot or whatever, it'll be down. We won't lose track of where we are. And we're going to sew until we're just about 1/4 of an inch from the end. And when we're just about 1/4 of an inch to the end, my foot is lifted up so it's in pivot position, and I'm going to turn until the corner of my fabric is lined up with that red mark and needle on my foot. And I'm going to sew out at a diagonal, and I'm going to cut it. And the reason why I do that, trying to get that into the camera so that you can see how I sewed off. I went to 1/4 of an inch from the end, and then I sewed off at a diagonal, right up to that corner of my fabric. And the reason why I do that is because when I go to fold this, you want to fold it up, and you're going to want it to fold in a 45-degree angle. And just finger press it. And then you're going to fold this down so it makes almost kind of like a box. You can feel your diagonal fold underneath here. You want to make sure on this side that it's lined up straight. You don't want it to be lined up like this. Let me get my awl so that I can hold this so that you can see it properly. You would not want it to be folded like this because you won't get a nice corner. So you just want to make sure that when you fold it down, that your edges meet up on this side and that this is lined up on this side. And this bias binding is stretchier, and that's because we're going to be going around more curves with it, so it's nice to have that little extra stretch. Just be careful you're not stretching it, you know, pulling and tugging on it and causing it to overstretch while you're sewing it on a straight side. And I'm going to start from the very end of the fabric. And we're going to stitch it right up until we get to where we had measured down 3.5 inches and we made our cut so that it went in an angle for our envelope. We're going to sew rather until we get to this 1/4 of an inch away from this corner here. And you just keep this lined up with your raw edges staying together. And you just want to make sure that your binding stays flat, doesn't bubble up on this side. And I'm going to make myself a little mark. Well, I might, if I could, oh, there's my pen. Just to show you, you can make a mark 1/4 of an inch from that corner. Onto your binding. And that'll just give you a visual aid. So as you're getting, because this is kind of awkward on this side, it's not going to land exactly flat according to this side. It would be further. I'm going to be going by the very edge of my fabric where I'm at 1/4 of an inch. And then once again, I'm going to pivot my fabric and I'm going to sew off at a, well, somewhat of a diagonal to that corner. And once again, I'm going to fold this up so I have that diagonal line coming off of my corner. And I'm only focused on my corner. I'm not focused on this part of my fabric. I'm only focused on that corner. And then I'm going to lay this down flat. The only difference of what's going to happen here is that in order for me to come straight, I'm going to work my fabric so that it's kind of going in a corner, in kind of like a half-ish circle. But I don't want it to pucker. So I was folding it up just so I can see. And actually, I think that's going to work just a little bit better coming around that corner. And we'll start sewing right about here on our fabric. And so we're going to go straight until we get to that point on the top of our envelope. I lost my ruler. I lost my ruler. Oh, found it. Now I'm going to measure 1/4 of an inch away from this edge as well, just to give me a guideline of where I'm going to hit that point. And I'm going to turn my fabric again, only this time I'm going to be, I have my point so it's matched up with my needle and that center line on my foot, and I'm going to sew off straight. well, it came out somewhat straight. I just was trying to get it sewed off so that I can bend my fabric around. And I'm going to do the same thing here that I did on that last corner. I'm just having this folded up a little ways. So I have this meeting up with my top, and I've got it folded more like this, but I need it to come straight. So you just have to kind of fidget with it. And I'm going to sew until I get down to that next corner. And I'm going to get myself right to about 1/4 of an inch from the end. Make myself a little line there so that I know. And you can measure it just so that you're more comfortable. And I'm going to turn it, and I'm going to come off at a diagonal. And once again, I'm just going to fold my fabric up. See if I can get my awl over here. So I'm getting it as straight as I can across the top there. But I need it to come down on the side so it comes down straight on the side. So it's not exactly like straight on the side like we did when we first started out. And once again, we're going to stitch this until we're 1/4 of an inch from the bottom corner. And we'll turn it and we'll sew out at a diagonal. And this is where we're going to do the fold just like we did before, where we're going to have our mitered corner. And we're going to be keeping our corners straight, just like we did when we first started out. So you'll have this side flush, and you'll have this side flush. Now here I can see that my two pieces are going to overlap go over each other, I'm going to fold this over and I'm going to trim so I can get rid of the rest of that bias binding out of my way. Now I can just set that to the side for when I have another project to use it for. Trim my thread out of the way. Now normally we would connect these at kind of an angle, and I'm not going to do that for this. I'm going to trim this. I'm a ways away from my stitching, probably a couple of inches away from where I began stitching, and I'm going to trim that. And I'll cut my thread from where I am. And I'm going to lay this flat, my bias binding, so it's not stretched, but laying flat. And you can have it so that it stretches just a little bit. And I'm going to trim it so that it will be 1/4 of an inch extra on this side and 1/4 of an inch extra on that side. And it might help you while you have it laid down to make a little mark right here and on the other side so that you know, and then mark it up. After you let go of it, you can mark it 1/4 of an inch up on each side from where you made your mark laying down so that you know where to cut. So now I'm just going to open these up. And I'm going to fold my piece kind of almost in half, my sleeve itself. And I'm just going to lay these end to end, keeping my pieces of binding flat. I'm going to put a pin over here on this end of it. And I'll put a pin in the center just so that I can keep this together, getting it over to my machine. And we just don't want to pucker it up. When we sew, we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch across, but you just want to keep both sides flat, the bottom and the top. And I had to fold my sleeve pretty much in half, so that I can get this over to where I need to sew. Let me see, I'll use my awl to hold that together while I'm getting it up underneath here. It's getting stuck on the feed dogs. Okay, now I can hold it off to the side and put my needle down. And you're just going to do 1/4 of an inch across here. Just make sure that you feel and make sure that that's staying flat, not all puckered up. Oh, so it's going to be stubborn on me. My bobbin thread didn't catch. But the things that happen when you're trying to film. My thread came out. So just rethread it. I probably pulled it out when I was messing with stuff. And I'm just going to check my bobbin while I'm right here so I don't do that twice. Okay, so once again, we'll get this under here nice and flat. And we're just going to do our 1/4 inch seam. And when you get to your pins, you can take your pins out and just double check it to make sure that it's staying flat but not stretched, and sew across. Now, these two ends move just a little bit on me, so I'm going to get these fixed. I'm going to leave your needle down if you have to do adjustments. And I'll just get my awl under here and get this brought back so that it's nice and flat on top of each other. And just finish sewing. So now those two pieces are joined just like this. We're going to open it up. And I'm just going to finger press my seams so that they're open. Or seam, rather. And I'll just press it open. And then I'm going to let this fold back. But I'm not going to stretch. I'm not going to pull on it. I want it to stay nice and flat and not stretch it, because the bias binding is a little stretchy. So I'm going to start sewing just a little bit before I ended. And I'm going to secure my stitch. I'm going to stitch forward a couple stitches, then reverse, and then come back, and I'll sew, and I'm going to go over this where I began, just by a little bit. And it's wanting to pucker just a little bit there on me, so I'm going to flatten this out and hold it down as it goes in there. There we go. So I'm going to go just a little bit past my stitches, and then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to reverse 3/4 stitches and then come back. And I forgot to put my let me see. I forgot to put my elastic in. Well, that's okay. I'll show you how we can do that after. So, I trim these threads out of my way. And I'm going to fold my, now I've that was on my front side. And you can finger press. You can turn your, and this is actually good to do, just turn your binding over and just finger press along the straight edges. It just makes it nicer when you go to fold it over. It will fold over a little smoother for you. Now, when I was putting my binding on, what I was going to do was I was going to put my elastic there as I was sewing my binding around, and I was going to have my elastic underneath my binding. So as I came around, I would have had my elastic stuck up under here. So to fix that before I go any further, I'm just going to take a couple stitches out. Just remember when you come back, when you're doing your binding, to go ahead and stick your elastic in here. These aren't my normal projects to do. Usually I do a lot of quilting. Not that I haven't made these before. I've made a few of them. My kids always like to have the sleeves. So I'm just going to, I just pulled out just enough stitches. So I've got a hole here. And so as I was going around originally with my binding, I would have taken my two ends and put them together nice and flat. You could even put a little tiny piece of tape on there if you wanted. And make sure that your elastic isn't twisted. If your elastic is twisted, just get it so that it's untwisted. Just holding it so you have your loop up here, and then just bring your fingers down so that your elastic isn't twisted. And then you're just going to lay them next to each other. And this is what I would have done when I was going around with my binding, is I would have laid this underneath my binding, nice and flat at that point, with some poking through to the other side just to make sure that it gets latched on there. And so you would have just a little bit, and we'll trim those afterward. And so now I'm just going to go and I'm going to re-sew my binding on that edge. And I can go ahead and trim those edges of my elastic off. Like I said, you're probably watching the tutorial ahead of time, so you won't make the mistake that Terry did. But then you have your elastic there. And I'm going to be sewing my button right here where the point is. So the fact that mine is off to the side a little bit is going to be perfectly fine, because when it wraps around, it'll come back and it will attach. It will go over your button. Now, if you were doing it while we were doing our binding, that would have been stuck there and it would have been just fine. But that's okay. So what I am going to do with my elastic to keep it out of my way as I'm doing the back side of my binding is I'm going to pin my elastic so that it's out of my way. So I'll just put a pin in each side of it. And then I'm going to put another pin down here so that it stays, so it doesn't flop over on me. And just kind of stays stuck out of my way. Okay, so now that's secured. I can flip this over, and I'm going to start at the bottom about where I ended off and joined. I'm going to start just a little bit before that join, and I'm going to clip this with some clips. You could use pins. Pins are perfectly fine. And just go ahead and clip your binding just on the straight part. We'll adjust the corners and stuff as we go, but just go ahead and put some clips along the straight edge of your binding just to hold it in place, so as we go around it'll be folded over. Okay, so we have it clipped all the way around, so our binding's going to the back like this. And we're going to start about midway in the bottom, and you just, as you go, you're going to make sure that your binding is folded underneath. Now I'm using a stitch in the ditch foot. It's just that the guide, let me put my needle down. Whoop, that was the wrong spot for my needle. I need to move my needle over just a little bit, because I want my needle, I keep losing my tools. I want to be sewing right here, right at the edge of the binding, not on the binding, preferably. Now you could do a decorative stitch across this, and that would be perfectly fine as well. We're just getting the binding to hold down and be flat. So I'm going to stitch in the ditch, sort of between the fabric. We call this a ditch right here, where the seam is coming up against your fabric. So I'm going to sew as straight as I can right in there. This guide on a stitch in the ditch foot is centered, and I'm just going to be straight stitching. If you only have if you don't have the stitch in the ditch foot, don't worry. You can use a regular foot, and just keep an eye that your needle is staying straight, and that you're following this red guideline across your fabric like this. So your foot will be here, and you'll be kind of watching that red guideline, that it's staying straight on that edge. Now if that bothers you, sometimes it's hard. This is a nice project to practice on, doing this kind of binding or any kind of binding. this is the kind of project that's nice to practice on. If it bothers you that your stitches, you know, in the beginning, if you're not used to doing this, might wave and some end up a little bit on your binding, some down here, you can always do a decorative stitch and just stay as straight as you can, and it will catch both sides, and that would look pretty. You could do a zigzag, that would look pretty. However you want to do it, that you feel the most comfortable. But I think this is a really good way to practice. So I'm going to get my needle so it goes down between the binding fabric and here. So I kind of want it up against my white binding, but not on it. And with my fingers, I'm just going to check to make sure that the binding is pressed under, out of my way. So we'll have a nice look on the top. Okay, so we're going to sew until we're almost at our corner, not quite, so I can show you how we're going to handle our corner. And I'll be able to flip this up in a minute and show you how it's catching the binding that's underneath it. So we'll get just a little bit closer to our edge. And I stop every so often and make sure that this is folded nicely, so that this is folded flat underneath, not bunched up. And then I'll continue to sew. So right here, I'm going to be at my corner. So I'm going to take my finger, I'll use my awl, hopefully this will be more visual. So I'm just going to fold this down, and I'm going to fold this over so that it's at like a 45-degree corner. Now it might not be perfect, and that's fine, because this is going to be the inside. This isn't going to show. So it's not really a big problem. If you were doing a quilt, you would want to get a perfect 45-degree, and you could just push that up a little bit more until you can get this to fold down perfect so that it comes into your 45-degree angle. And I'm just going to hold that in place and lay it down and hold it with my finger in place. Or you can hold it with your awl, which is fine too, and that will just hold it in place. And we're going to sew until our needle is right in that corner. And just go a little slow. And when you're getting close to where your needle's going to be, just let go of it, because your foot's going to hold that in place. And I'm going to sew until I can see that my needle hits right in the very corner. And then I'm going to turn it. And I'm going to flip this over and see how it's catching the edge of my other binding. That's what we're trying to make sure that we do. We want to catch this edge of the binding on the inside so that it stays stitched down. And you just want to check it, you know, every so often to make sure that you're catching both. If you miss, then just go back to that point and sew it. And see, I'm almost up against this binding. It's not perfect, but I'm pretty close to that binding. When I press this, it'll look a little bit better. But I just want to be as close as I can, not sewing into the binding itself, but just right up against it with my needle. And that's kind of, this is kind of why I clipped it as I went around, to keep my binding flat underneath, to make it a little easier for me to go and not have to check it every 2 minutes, but that keeps it nice and flat. And I can see here that it's nice and flat and pretty even. And so I'm at my very corner, and I'm just going to continue to sew until I'm almost to the next corner, which will be over here, where we're getting to the upper side of our envelope. And I'm just double checking down here. Now you can see I missed catching my binding on the other side. So I'm just going to cut my stitch here. And I was pretty sure that that was going to happen, because when I twisted it, I could see that I twisted that binding so it wasn't where I needed it. So I'm going to go ahead and take those stitches out. Only takes a second, since I'm really close by and I could tell that I already did that. Now if this happens to you and you're, further away and you can't get it flattened down so that you can get into it, you could always hand tack it on the back side, because it's going to be on the inside. No one's going to see this, and it gives you some practice on doing your binding. And I'm just going to pull those extra stitches out now that I pulled that apart. And I'm just going to make sure that this is folded over. And you can even measure it to make sure that you have 1/4 of an inch of binding. Because if you have 1/4 of an inch of binding, then it's going to catch that underneath part. And I'm just going to put it back up at the corner. And then I'll stitch it again. And as we're removing clips, whoops, we just want to make sure that we're getting this folded under so that the top side is nice and flat, but it's about 1/4 of an inch, so that we're catching the underneath part. And I'll double check it again, and this time I'm catching it. I'm a little bit further in than I wanted to be, but I know that I've got my binding nice and straight, and I'm catching the underneath. And we'll go all the way up to that corner. Just keep checking your binding as you go. String poking through, so I'm gonna clip that thread there. Now when I get almost to my corner again, once again I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to fold this over. And this was the little tricky part because it's not going to be exactly a perfect 45-degree, but it will be close. So I have my fold on the back side, and once again I'm going to come up into this corner right here. And when I hit that corner, I'm going to turn, and I'm going to take my awl and I'm going to push it underneath just to make sure that I'm getting my binding nice and flat under there, and keep it at 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to sew until I'm almost to the point at the top of the envelope. Okay, and so I'm at the top, almost to the point. Now, if I had done my elastic while I was doing my binding, that elastic would have been sitting more right here, but it's fine that it's sitting a little to the side. I'm just going to lift this up, and I'm going to make sure that my binding folds properly underneath. And I'll just hold that in place. And we're trying to get it to be almost a point at the top. So it's sort of going to look like this on the back side. Folded, and then just lay it down and hold it in place. You can use your awl to hold this side down. And we're going to stop when our needle is right in the center where that point would be. And we're not going to worry about our elastic because that's staying nice and flat. And it's going to get sewed down. As we're doing our binding. And once again, we're going to make sure that this stays nicely folded. And we're going to sew until we come to our next corner. And I'm going a little slow because I know I'm going over a little more thickness because of the fold underneath and because of my elastic being there. Whoop. I think I got a little bit on top of my binding. And we'll get almost to our corner again. And we're going to do the same exact thing on this corner. I'm going to trim those threads right there. Get those out of the way. Whoops. And then once again, I'm going to check underneath that I have this, have my binding down where I need it. And I'm going to get this folded. Check my top. And you might have to pinch it a little bit to flatten it out. Sometimes it'll be a little thick because you have your corner sticking in there. excuse me. And once again, you're just going to get your fold so it's like this in the back. Hold it down. And I'm going to sew until I'm into the corner right there on my corner. I'm going to have my needle stop right there. I'm going to go back one stitch because I got just one stitch too far. There we go. And you can see it's starting to come together. It's starting to look pretty nice on the top. So you're just going to keep track of your binding, that it's folded nice underneath, that this is staying nice and flat, and we're going to sew all the way down to the next corner. Whoop. Hit my paddle just a little too hard. You just stop and fold your binding underneath, and then continue. If you see any threads poking out, you can stop and clip those. And we'll get almost to that corner. Oh, throwing clips around. So once again, we're at that nice corner on the other side of where we began. Just kind of hold this up. Get this nice and straight. And then we're going to fold this over until we get our 45-degree angle. We're pretty close. Like I said, this is on the inside. No one's going to be seeing the inside of your sleeve. But I'm going to get that as close to a 45-degree as I possibly can. And I'm just going to pinch it a little bit because I know that it's a little fat right there. And then nicely lay it down and hold on to it with your awl. Or you could hold it with a pair of scissors or tweezers, whatever you have. And I'm going to sew right into that corner so that my needle stops right in the corner. Pivot my fabric. I think I went one stitch too far again. So I'll go back just one stitch. And we're almost at the end of stitching our binding down. Whoop, forgot to go forward. There we go. Sometimes when I hit my reverse button, it doesn't go in reverse like I wanted to. So I'm going to sew just a little bit past where my stitches began, and then I'm going to reverse 3-4 stitches, and then come forward 3-4 stitches and cut my thread. And and I'll trim those threads underneath. And just take a look at your binding. See that your binding is down on all your sides. And it is, except for that one spot that I had to stop and take my stitches out. Other than that, they're all good. I'm going to take that pin out where I have it holding my elastic down. And now I'm going to pin that elastic up to the top. Or actually, I'll just clip it. It'll be easier to put a clip there. You can pin it if that's all that you have. It's just easier for me to put a little clip up there and a little clip to the side just to keep my elastic up out of my way. And I still have my pins holding it in the sleeve, in the envelope part at the top. So now we're going to be taking either your tablet or your what was I going to say, or your tablet or your laptop. Oh my goodness. And I've got that little bit of a lip right here, and I'm just going to put my surface up to that. And all I'm wanting to do is to see how this needs to fold. So I've got that nice and neat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my sides here. Make sure I'm getting this in the camera. Okay, so I'm going to line up my sides right here from my corner that's right there. I just want to line it up so that my binding edges will be right against each other, and I'm going to clip this going all down the side that way. So it will be nice and flat on this side. And then I'm going to turn it so that I can do my other side. So I just want to make sure that I'm keeping these up against each other. And just 3-4 pins or 3-4 clips just to keep this in place. And then I can take out my surface or your laptop, tablet, whatever. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my needle right into the corner of my binding up here. I'm going to secure my stitch. I'm going to come forward, go in reverse, come forward, just so that that's staying nice. And I'm going to go past my binding when I go in reverse and come back. I'm going to do that a couple times because I want to lock this side down. I don't want, when I'm putting stuff in, for this to tear my stitches underneath or to be folding back and forth. I want to have that nice and secure right there. So actually you can start right on the binding on that edge. That's perfectly fine. But I'm going to secure that, and just go slow because it's going to be a little bit thick right there where the two bindings are coming together. And I'll reverse over that. just so I'm getting 3 or 4 stitches over that, so it locks it down nice and tight. And I'm going to sew until right where I sewed before on this top part, right up against my binding, to join my 2 pieces together. And I'm going to sew right to the very bottom, and then I'm going to reverse about 3-4 stitches, and then go forward and I can cut my stitch. That way I've secured it at the top and I've secured it at the bottom. So you'll see up here at this corner, it's nice attached, it's not flopping over. And I'll go ahead and trim those stitches, or threads rather. Telling you, between stitches and threads and pins and needles, I'm always saying the wrong one. And we're just about done. So we're going to do the same thing, except we're going to start in the bottom, and we're going to secure our stitch there, and we're going to come down to the end of this side and secure it. And just go slow again. I got it stuck just a little bit, so it doesn't want to get going. Let me cut that. I'm going to move over just a tad. My bottom is catching on my feed dogs, so it doesn't want to sew. It was kind of holding it back at the feed dogs. If that happens to you, just take it out. And just make sure that you get your piece, and you might have to get your piece under there a little bit more on your feed dogs, and then go in reverse after you've gone forward a little bit. There we go. And we're just going to do the same thing on this side. Just doing the stitch in the ditch, following where we had sewed before. Now when you get up to this corner, remember it's going to be thick right in there, so just go slow over it. Make sure your 2 sides, your 2 pieces are flush up against each other right here. So this isn't pulled over here or something. You want it up against the edge so it's nice and flush. And I'm going to hold that down with my awl so it doesn't shift on me while I'm sewing. And I'm going to sew right up to the end and then reverse. And I'll just do that a couple times just so I get that nice and secured. And then you can go ahead and cut your thread. And we'll trim those threads while we're right here. You can take your clips off of your elastic and the pins out that we had securing the elastic. So your final touch on this, and your button doesn't have to be this big, mind you, but I just thought the big button will look cute right here. So I'm just going to sew a button right there in the center of my and you could have your elastic, you know, going to one side, that's fine. And so I'm going to sew my elastic right there. So when my tablet's inside, which we've left plenty of room, it slides in, but it's not so big and so loose that it doesn't give it a nice secure fit. That's pretty secure, but we're not fighting it into the envelope either. So when you fold this over, I'm just going to put my button here like I was telling you, like so. And then when my elastic goes around and underneath, my elastic will be able to come up over my button like that. And my button will hold, well, when it's sewed down, it will hold my elastic up over there. And that will keep my top of my envelope down and in place. And I think that will look pretty cute with the button right there. So I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial. It's been a lot of fun for me. I think that's going to be real pretty. And this has been from Seaside Quilting Tutorials. My name is Terry. If you've enjoyed the tutorial, if you found it helpful, please take a moment and like our video. Join our channel, Seaside Quilting Supplies. And there's a little bell right next to the subscribe button. You can click on that and you can change it so that you can receive all notifications when more tutorials come out. And we have many more tutorials coming ahead of us. Some will be a little more challenging. Some will be basic, informational, like doing, like with the bias binding, with doing other binding. So we look forward to seeing you again. Happy sewing.